In a forest, a simple man suffered an accident. Suddenly he was found by a pack of threatening wolves. He lowered his head, certain that it would be his end, but what happened next would leave him emotional forever. Before discovering this enchanting tale, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more animal stories. On a quiet day in the woods, the sky was a deep blue, leaves whispered softly in the breeze, and small animals scurried between the trees. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, creating a serene and welcoming atmosphere. Among the hunters roaming the forest that day was Jack, a middle-aged man with keen eyes and silent steps. While his companions talked in low voices discussing hunting strategies, Jack remained alert, his senses sharpened by years of experience in the wilderness. It was then that he noticed something different. A sound that stood out from the constant murmur of the forest, a weak and desperate whimper. Jack stopped, tilting his head to listen better. "Did you hear that?" he asked his companions. The other hunters paused for a moment, listening. After a few seconds, one of them shrugged. "Must be just the wind or some small animal. Let's keep going, we're wasting time." But Jack couldn't ignore the sound. There was something in that whimper that struck a chord in his heart. "Go on ahead," he told the others. "I'm going to check out what it is. I'll meet you back at camp later." His friends briefly protested, insisting that he was wasting a good hunting day. "Let it go, Jack. Whatever it is, it probably won't survive anyway," one of them argued. But Jack was determined. With a nod, he moved away from the group, leaving them to continue the hunt without him. Guided by the intermittent whimper, Jack moved away from the main trail, entering a denser area of the forest. The sounds led him to a small embankment, covered with fallen leaves and broken branches. It was there, partially hidden by vegetation, that Jack found the source of the whimpering. It was a wolf pup, no larger than a medium-sized dog. The animal was clearly injured, one of its hind legs bent at an odd angle. Its eyes, a penetrating golden yellow, were wide with fear and pain. Jack felt his heart tighten. In all his years as a hunter, he had never encountered a situation like this. The pup was vulnerable, defenseless. Leaving it there would be condemning it to certain death, either by starvation or predators. Carefully, Jack approached the pup. The small wolf tried to move away, but the pain in its paw prevented it. Jack spoke softly, trying to calm the frightened animal. "Easy, little one," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." Slowly, Jack extended his hand, allowing the pup to smell him. The wolf, still trembling, cautiously sniffed Jack's fingers. After a few tense moments, the pup seemed to relax a bit, as if understanding that Jack posed no threat. With careful movements, Jack picked up the pup in his arms. The animal was surprisingly light, its thin body showing that it had probably been alone for some time. At that moment, Jack made a decision that would change his life forever. He couldn't simply leave the pup there to die. Despite being a hunter, there was something about this small being that awakened his compassion. "I'm going to take you home, little one," Jack said softly. "We'll take care of that paw and put some food in that belly." With the pup secure in his arms, Jack began the journey back. He knew his hunting companions wouldn't understand his decision. Hunters saving wolves wasn't something you saw every day, but Jack felt he was doing the right thing. As he walked through the forest, the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Jack looked at the pup in his arms, noticing how its golden eyes reflected the colors of the sky. "Everything's going to be all right," he murmured, more to himself than to the wolf. "I promise to take care of you." And so, with determined steps, Jack headed towards his ranch, carrying with him not just an injured wolf pup, but also the beginning of a journey that would test the limits of friendship, loyalty, and understanding between man and animal. The path back to the ranch seemed endless to Jack. The weight of the wolf pup in his arms and the concern for its health made each step a challenge. When he finally caught sight of the familiar outlines of his property, the sun had already set completely, leaving the sky painted with the first stars of the night. Upon arriving home, Jack was greeted by the anxious barking of his hunting dogs. The scent of the wolf made them agitated, but a firm command from Jack was enough to calm them down. He knew he would have to be careful in the coming days to avoid conflicts between the dogs and the new guest. Inside the house, Jack quickly improvised a place for the pup. He went to the barn and found some clean hay and an old blanket, which he used to create a makeshift bed in a quiet corner of the kitchen. Carefully, he placed the small wolf in this cozy nest. The pup, exhausted by the journey and weakened by its injuries, barely moved when Jack put it in the bed. Its golden eyes, once so lively, were now half closed with fatigue and pain. "Hang in there, little one," Jack murmured, gently stroking the animal's head. "We're going to take care of you." Jack spent the following hours caring for the pup. He carefully cleaned its wounds with warm water and a clean cloth, applied a homemade ointment he kept for emergencies, and very carefully immobilized the injured paw using strips of cloth. Throughout the process, the pup remained surprisingly calm, only occasionally letting out a low whimper of pain. Jack spoke constantly to it in a soft voice, trying to reassure it. When he finished the medical care, Jack realized that the pup was probably starving. He went to the pantry and got some pieces of dried meat he kept for winter. He cut the meat into small pieces and offered it to the wolf. At first, the pup hesitated, looking suspiciously at the food. But the smell of the meat soon overcame its fear, and it began to eat eagerly. Jack watched, satisfied, feeling that he had made the right choice in bringing the animal home. The days that followed established a new routine on the ranch. Jack spent much of his time caring for the pup, changing its bandages, feeding it, and simply keeping it company. Gradually, the small wolf gained strength, and its personality began to reveal itself. It was curious and intelligent, its golden eyes following Jack's every move around the house. As it began to feel more comfortable, it started responding to Jack's voice, sometimes with a slight wag of its tail, other times with an attentive look. A week after finding it in the forest, Jack decided it was time to give the pup a name. After considering several options, he chose to call it Shadow, due to its dark grey fur and its tendency to follow Jack like a shadow. As time passed, Shadow recovered. Its injured paw began to heal, and soon it was taking its first hesitant steps around the kitchen. Jack watched with a mixture of pride and concern, knowing that the stronger Shadow became, the harder it would be to keep it in the house. A month after the rescue, Shadow was completely recovered. It now walked freely around the house and yard, always under Jack's watchful eye. The hunting dogs, initially hostile, had grown accustomed to the wolf's presence, although they maintained a respectful distance. It was during this time that Jack began to notice something peculiar. Wherever he went on the property, Shadow followed. If Jack went to check the fences, there was Shadow trotting by his side. If he went to the barn to feed the animals, Shadow accompanied him, curiously observing. The bond between them was growing, stronger, transcending the relationship between a man and a pet. One afternoon, while Jack was working in the field, he noticed that Shadow was not in sight. For a moment, he felt a twinge of worry. Had the pup finally answered the call of nature and left? But then, as he turned to head back to the house, he saw Shadow sitting patiently at the edge of the field, waiting for him. Jack's heart filled with an emotion he couldn't name. It was more than affection, more than simple attachment. It was a deep bond, a mutual understanding that defied logic. That night, sitting on the porch with Shadow at his feet, Jack reflected on the journey they had shared so far. The frightened and injured pup he had found in the forest had transformed into a loyal and confident companion. "You really are special, aren't you?" Jack murmured, scratching Shadow's ears. The wolf raised its head, its golden eyes meeting Jack's, with an intensity that seemed almost human. At that moment, Jack understood that as much as he had saved Shadow that day in the forest, the wolf had also saved him in a way. It had brought a new purpose to his life, a connection with nature that he, as a hunter, had never expected to experience. As the stars shone in the night sky and the soft sounds of the night enveloped them, Jack made a silent promise. He would care for Shadow, protect him, and when the time came, do what was best for him, even if that meant letting him go. But for now, on that quiet night, man and wolf rested side by side, united by a bond that neither of them fully understood, but that both knew was precious and rare. The months passed and Shadow grew rapidly. The small pup that Jack had rescued was now a young, strong wolf full of energy. His dark grey coat shone with health, and his golden eyes maintained the intensity that had captivated Jack from the first day. As Shadow grew, Jack faced new challenges. The wolf's natural instinct began to manifest more strongly, and Jack knew he needed to find a balance between allowing Shadow to express his wild nature and keeping him safe on the ranch. One morning, Jack decided it was time to give Shadow a chance to explore beyond the property limits. With a slightly heavy heart, he took the wolf to the edge of the forest. "Go on, Shadow," Jack said softly, gesturing towards the trees. "You're free to explore if you want." Shadow looked at Jack, then at the forest. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate, his wild instincts fighting against the bond he had formed with the man. Then, to Jack's surprise and secret relief, Shadow took a few steps towards the forest, but soon returned to the hunter's side. Jack smiled, patting the wolf's head. "All right, friend, let's go back home." This scene repeated itself several times in the following weeks. Jack would take Shadow to the forest, giving him the opportunity to leave. Each time, the wolf explored a bit more, sometimes staying out of sight for hours. But invariably, at the end of the day, Shadow would return to the ranch. The animal's insistence on remaining by Jack's side was proof of the depth of his loyalty. Gradually, the hunter began to accept that Shadow had chosen him as his family, defying nature's expectations. However, life on the ranch wasn't always easy. The other animals, especially the chickens, still showed nervousness in Shadow's presence. Jack had to be constantly vigilant to ensure that the wolf's predatory instinct didn't override the training he was trying to instill. One afternoon, while Jack was working in the field, he heard a commotion coming from the chicken coop. He ran there, fearing the worst. To his relief, he found Shadow sitting calmly outside the chicken coop, observing the agitated chickens, but making no move to attack them. "Good boy, Shadow," Jack praised, feeling proud of the wolf's restraint. It was further proof of how Shadow was adapting to life on the ranch, balancing his wild nature with respect for the boundaries established by Jack. As the days passed, Jack and Shadow fell into a comfortable routine. They worked together on the ranch, with Shadow helping to gather the cattle and keep predators away. At night, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, a moment of peace that both seemed to equally appreciate. However, Jack couldn't ignore the reality that Shadow was a wild animal. Sometimes, especially on full moon nights, he would hear the wolf howl, a melancholic sound that echoed across the property. In these moments, Jack wondered if he was being fair in keeping Shadow on the ranch, away from his true nature. One day, while walking through the forest, they found tracks of other wolves. Shadow became visibly agitated, sniffing the air and the marks on the ground intensely. Jack observed, feeling a mixture of apprehension and sadness. He knew that the day would come when he would have to make a difficult decision about Shadow's future. That night, sitting on the porch with Shadow by his side, Jack reflected on everything they had been through together. The wolf had become much more than a pet. He was a friend, a companion, an integral part of his life. "What are we going to do, huh, Shadow?" Jack murmured, scratching the wolf's ears. Shadow looked at him, his golden eyes full of trust and affection. Jack knew that eventually he would have to give Shadow the opportunity to choose his own path. But for now he allowed himself to enjoy the wolf's company, grateful for the unique bond they had formed. As the stars shone in the night sky, Jack made a silent promise. He would do what was best for Shadow, even if it meant letting him go one day. But until then, he would continue to care for him, protect him, and learn from him. And so man and wolf fell asleep under the starry sky, united by a bond of friendship and trust that defied logic, but was stronger and truer than either of them could have imagined. The months passed, and life on Jack's ranch continued its tranquil course, with Shadow as a constant and comforting presence. The bond between man and wolf had grown even stronger, solidifying a mutual trust that seemed unshakable. However, the peace was shattered on a fateful night. Jack was awakened by a commotion coming from the chicken coop. The sound of panicked chickens and the frantic beating of wings filled the night air. Jumping out of bed, Jack ran outside, his heart racing in his chest. Upon reaching the chicken coop, Jack was confronted with a scene of destruction that made his blood run cold. All of his chickens had been attacked and killed. Bloody feathers covered the ground, and the metallic smell of blood hung in the air. Jack's heart sank. His first thought was of Shadow. Despite the bond between them, Jack knew that a wolf's predatory instinct was strong. Had Shadow finally given in to his wild nature? The suspicion hurt, but Jack couldn't ignore it. Shadow was, after all, a natural predator. However, without concrete evidence, Jack decided not to jump to conclusions. He loved Shadow and trusted him, but he knew he needed to stay alert. Looking around, Jack saw no sign of Shadow. The wolf usually slept near the house, but that night he was nowhere to be seen. This only increased Jack's suspicions, although his heart refused to believe that Shadow could have done something like this. Determined to uncover the truth, Jack decided to keep watch the following night. He rebuilt the chicken coop as best he could during the day, putting the few surviving chickens back in place. At night he hid near the rebuilt chicken coop, hoping that the culprit would return to the scene of the crime. The hours passed slowly. Jack fought against sleep, his eyes attentive to any movement. Shadow had returned during the day, acting normally, which only confused Jack more. The wolf now slept near the house, apparently oblivious to his human friend's vigil. It was then that Jack saw it, a small agile form moving in the shadows. It wasn't Shadow, but a marten, known for its ferocity and ability to hunt birds. The small predator moved silently towards the chicken coop, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. Before Jack could react, a grey blur passed by him like lightning. It was Shadow, who had also noticed the intruder's presence. The wolf advanced against the marten, determined to protect Jack's property. The fight that followed was intense. The marten, although smaller, was agile and fierce. Shadow used his strength and size to his advantage, but the marten didn't yield easily. Jack watched, amazed at Shadow's courage and loyalty. Finally, after several minutes of combat, Shadow managed to drive away the marten. The small predator fled into the forest, defeated. Shadow, exhausted and injured, collapsed on the ground, panting. Jack ran to his friend's side, his heart overflowing with emotion. His initial suspicion had been unfair, and now he clearly saw Shadow's true nature, not just a wild animal, but a loyal and courageous protector. Carefully, Jack brought Shadow inside the house. He spent the night tending to the wolf's wounds, cleaning and bandaging the cuts left by the marten's sharp claws. Throughout the process, Shadow remained docile, completely trusting Jack. As he cared for Shadow, Jack reflected on the extraordinary bond they had formed. A hunter and a wolf, two creatures that should naturally be opposed, had become an unlikely family. "You're much more than I could have imagined, my friend," Jack murmured, gently stroking Shadow's head. The wolf looked at him, his golden eyes full of an understanding that seemed to transcend the barriers between species. That night, as Shadow slept at the foot of his bed, Jack made a silent promise. He would protect Shadow with the same fierceness with which the wolf had protected his ranch. Together they would face any challenge the future might bring. And so, under the roof of the small house on the ranch, man and wolf rested, united by a bond of loyalty and love that defied logic, but was stronger and truer than either of them could have imagined. The months following the incident with the marten brought a new dynamic to Jack and Shadow's life. Their bond, already strong, had deepened even further. Shadow was now not just a companion, but a guardian of the ranch, always alert to any threat. However, as Shadow entered full maturity, Jack began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. The wolf spent more time observing the forest, his golden eyes fixed on the green horizon with an intensity that Jack could not ignore. Sometimes on full moon nights, Shadow would howl, a melancholic sound that echoed across the property, calling for something that Jack could not provide. Jack knew in his heart that the time was coming to make a difficult decision. As much as he loved Shadow, as much as he valued his company, he understood that he could not deny the animal's true nature. Shadow was, above all, a wild creature, born to run free in the vast expanses of the forest. On an autumn morning, when the leaves were beginning to turn golden and the air carried the first chill of the approaching winter, Jack decided it was time to let Shadow truly depart. With a heavy heart, he prepared for one last journey with his faithful companion. Jack led Shadow to a remote part of the forest, far beyond the familiar boundaries of their previous walks. It was a wild and untouched place, ideal for a wolf, to live in freedom. Throughout the journey, Jack spoke softly to Shadow, as if trying to explain his actions. "It's best for you, my friend," he murmured, more to himself than to the wolf. "You need to be with your own kind, live the life you were born for." When they reached a clearing surrounded by ancient trees, Jack stopped. It was time. With tears in his eyes, he knelt beside Shadow, embracing him one last time. "Go, Shadow," Jack said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're free now. Live the life you're meant to live." Shadow looked at Jack, his golden eyes seeming to understand the weight of the moment. For a long instant, man and wolf stared at each other, a silent communication passing between them. Then, slowly, Shadow turned and took a few steps towards the dense forest. At the edge of the clearing, Shadow stopped and looked back one last time. Jack forced a smile through his tears, waving goodbye. With one last glance, Shadow disappeared among the trees, leaving Jack alone with his memories and the pain of separation. The journey back to the ranch was the loneliest Jack had ever taken. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the silence of the forest echoing Shadow's absence at his side. Upon arriving home, the reality of Shadow's departure hit him with full force. The ranch seemed strangely empty, every corner reminding him of the friend who had left. Jack found himself calling for Shadow several times, only to remember with a pang in his heart that the wolf was no longer there. In the days that followed, Jack struggled to adapt to life without Shadow. The work on the ranch continued, but it lacked the joy and companionship that the wolf had brought. At night, sitting alone on the porch, Jack wondered where Shadow was, if he was safe, if he had found a new family among the wild wolves. Despite the sadness, Jack knew he had done the right thing. Shadow deserved the chance to live as a true wolf, to experience the freedom of wildlife, but that didn't make the separation any less painful. As weeks turned into months, Jack gradually found a new routine. The void left by Shadow was never fully filled, but the pain of loss was slowly replaced by a sense of gratitude for the years they had shared. On clear nights, when the moon was full, Jack sometimes heard distant howls coming from the forest. He liked to imagine that one of those howls belonged to Shadow, a reminder of the friend who had changed his life in so many ways. And so, as life on the ranch followed its course, Jack carried with him the memories of his friendship with Shadow, a treasure that time could not erase. The story of the hunter and the wolf had come to an end, but its impact would continue to resonate in the years to come. 2 years had passed since Jack had left Shadow in the forest. Life on the ranch had found a new rhythm, quieter and lonelier but no less meaningful. Jack continued his daily work, caring for the animals, planting and harvesting, always with the memory of Shadow as a silent presence in his thoughts. The seasons came and went, bringing changes to the landscape around the ranch. Jack noticed that since Shadow's departure, his relationship with nature had transformed. He hunted less now, preferring to observe and appreciate the forest animals from afar. The lessons of compassion and respect he had learned from Shadow had left a deep mark on his soul. On a cold winter afternoon, Jack was in the forest cutting firewood for the stove. The air was crisp and biting, and snow covered the ground in a white and silent blanket. The sounds of his axe echoed among the trees, breaking the quietude of the wintry woods. Focused on his task, Jack didn't notice that one of the trees he was cutting was leaning in the wrong direction. With a deafening crash, the tree fell, and Jack wasn't quick enough to fully get out of the way. The heavy trunk hit his leg, pinning him to the frozen ground. The pain was intense, and Jack quickly realized the gravity of his situation. He was alone, far from home, trapped under a tree too heavy for him to move on his own. He shouted for help but knew he was too far for anyone to hear him. The hours passed slowly. The cold began to seep into his bones, and Jack felt his strength diminishing. As the sun set, painting the sky red and orange, he began to lose hope. He thought of Shadow, wondering if the wolf was all right, if he had found a new family in the vastness of the forest. Darkness began to fall, and with it came an oppressive silence. Jack struggled to stay conscious, knowing that falling asleep in the cold could be fatal. It was then that he heard something, a distant sound almost imperceptible at first but growing stronger. The sound of paws running over snow, accompanied by low growls, filled the air. Jack's heart raced. Could it be wolves? The idea, which once would have filled him with fear, now brought a strange sense of hope. Suddenly they appeared. A pack of wolves emerged from the shadows of the forest, their eyes gleaming in the dim twilight. Jack held his breath, uncertain of what to expect. And then he saw him. Among the wolves was a familiar figure, larger and stronger than Jack remembered, but with the same penetrating golden eyes he knew so well. It was Shadow. The wolf approached quickly, recognizing Jack. Immediately, without hesitation, he began to dig in the snow around the fallen trunk, as if he understood exactly what needed to be done. To Jack's surprise, the other wolves followed suit, using their strong paws to clear away the snow and earth. Jack watched, amazed, as the pack worked in unison. It was as if Shadow was leading the others, guiding them in a joint effort to help his former human friend. With incredible effort, the pack managed to move the trunk enough for Jack to free himself. Shivering from cold and emotion, he crawled away from the fallen tree, hardly believing what had just happened. Shadow approached, gently touching his muzzle to Jack's face. The warmth of his body was comforting, bringing back memories of the years they had shared. Jack hugged the wolf, tears of gratitude and relief streaming down his face. "Thank you, my old friend," he whispered. "You saved me." Slowly, with Shadow's help, Jack managed to stand up. His leg hurt terribly, but he was alive, saved by the unlikely intervention of his former companion and his new family. The pack accompanied Jack on his journey back home, Shadow always by his side, offering support when he stumbled. As they approached the ranch, Jack felt a mix of emotions: relief to be home, gratitude for the unexpected help, and a deep admiration for Shadow's loyalty. Reaching the edge of the property, the other wolves began to withdraw, silently disappearing into the forest. Finally, only Shadow remained, his golden eyes fixed on Jack. Man and wolf stared at each other for a long moment, a silent communication passing between them. Jack knew this was another goodbye, perhaps the last, but this time there was no sadness, only a deep sense of gratitude and mutual understanding. "Go, Shadow," Jack said softly. "Your family needs you." Shadow looked at Jack one last time, his eyes conveying a silent message of farewell and affection. Then, with a final glance at the ranch that had once been his home, he turned and disappeared into the forest, returning to the wildlife that was now truly his. Jack stood still for a long moment, watching the spot where Shadow had disappeared. His heart was full of a mixture of joy and sadness, gratitude and longing. In that moment, he truly understood the power of friendship and loyalty, and how love can transcend the barriers between species. In the days following the rescue, Jack slowly recovered in his house. His leg, though bruised, wasn't broken, a miracle considering the weight of the tree that had fallen on him. As he rested, he had plenty of time to reflect on the extraordinary event he had experienced. The unexpected arrival of Shadow and his pack at the exact moment when Jack needed help most seemed like something out of a fairy tale. However, the pain in his leg and the vivid memories of the rescue were undeniable proof of the reality of what had occurred. Jack spent hours recalling every detail of that night: the sound of the wolves approaching, the sight of Shadow emerging. From the shadows, the incredible coordination of the pack working to free him. Each memory reinforced the depth of the bond he and Shadow had shared, a bond that had apparently withstood time and distance. As his leg healed, Jack began to make changes in his life. The near-death experience and the reunion with Shadow had awakened a new perspective in him. He decided to significantly reduce his hunting activities, focusing more on agriculture and raising domestic animals. In addition, Jack began to get more actively involved in the conservation of the local forest. He reached out to environmental groups in the region, offering his property as a safe place for wildlife observation. His unique experience with Shadow gave him a valuable perspective on the coexistence between humans and wild animals. One afternoon, while walking along the edge of his property, Jack spotted something that made his heart leap. In the distance, partially hidden by the trees, was a wolf. For a moment he thought it might be Shadow, but soon realized this animal was smaller, younger. The wolf observed him for a few moments before disappearing into the forest. Jack stood still, marveling at the encounter. Could it be possible that this was one of Shadow's offspring? The idea that his old friend's lineage might be thriving in the forest filled him with deep joy. In the months that followed, Jack had a few more glimpses of wolves on the outskirts of his property. He never got close enough to be sure if Shadow was among them, but the mere presence of the wolves was comforting. It was as if the forest was telling him that Shadow was doing well, living the life he was born for. Over time, Jack and Shadow's story began to spread. Neighbors and residents of the nearby town would come to the ranch to hear Jack tell about his friendship with the wolf and the incredible rescue. Many were skeptical at first, but something in Jack's sincerity and the passion with which he spoke ended up convincing even the most doubtful. The story became a kind of local legend, a tale of unlikely friendship and enduring loyalty that was passed down from generation to generation. Children in the region grew up hearing about the hunter and the wolf who became friends, learning valuable lessons about compassion, respect for nature, and the power of the bond between different species. For Jack, each retelling of his story was an opportunity to honor Shadow's memory and to promote greater understanding and respect for wolves and wildlife in general. He became a passionate advocate for conservation, using his personal experience to educate and inspire others. As the years passed, Jack aged, but never lost the sparkle in his eyes when he spoke of Shadow. On clear nights, he still liked to sit on the porch, looking out at the forest and remembering the days when a wolf was his constant companion. And sometimes, when the moon was full and the wind blew in the right direction, Jack could swear he heard a distant howl, a sound that made his heart fill with bittersweet joy and took him back, for a moment, to the days when he and Shadow ran together under the forest canopy. The years passed and Jack, now a white-haired man with slower steps, continued to live on his ranch at the edge of the forest. Although his physical strength had diminished with age, his eyes still shone with the same intensity when he spoke of Shadow and the adventures they had shared. Jack and Shadow's story had become much more than a simple local legend. Inspired. By his account, conservationists and researchers had initiated studies on the intelligence and social behavior of wolves. The region around Jack's ranch had been declared an environmental protection area, ensuring a safe habitat for wolves and other wild species. On a sunny spring afternoon, Jack received a special visit. It was Sarah, a young biologist who was conducting a study on the wolf population in the area. She had heard Jack's story countless times during her childhood and was now eager to hear the details directly from the source. Seated on the porch, with steaming cups of tea in their hands, Jack shared his story once more. He spoke about the day he found Shadow, about the years they spent together, the difficult decision to let him go, and the miraculous rescue years later. Sarah listened attentively, making occasional notes. When Jack finished, she had tears in her eyes. "Mr. Jack," she said, "your story is amazing, but I have something to tell you that might interest you." The young biologist explained that her team had identified a unique lineage of wolves in the region. These wolves exhibited unusual behaviors, including an atypically high tolerance for human presence and more sophisticated hunting strategies than normal. "We believe," Sarah continued, her voice trembling with excitement, "that these wolves may be descendants of Shadow. Your interaction with him seems to have influenced not only his behavior, but possibly even his genetics." Jack was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. The idea that Shadow's legacy continued to live on in the forest, not just as a story, but in the very nature of the wolves in the region, was almost too much for him to comprehend. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, taking something from her backpack. It was a photograph captured by one of the automatic cameras her team had installed in the forest. The image showed a majestic wolf with silver-grey fur and intensely golden eyes standing at the edge of a clearing. In the background, partially visible, was Jack's ranch. "We can't be certain," Sarah said softly, "but given the estimated age and location, well, we think this could be Shadow himself." Jack's hands trembled as he held the photograph. He stared at the image of the wolf, his heart pounding in his chest. Even after so many years, he would recognize those eyes anywhere. "It's him," Jack whispered, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. "My old friend is still around." That night, after Sarah had left with the promise to keep Jack informed about her discoveries, the old man sat on his porch as he had done so many times before. But this time something was different. The air seemed charged with a special energy, a sense of expectation. When the full moon rose on the horizon, bathing the forest in its silvery light, Jack heard it. A long, melodic howl, closer than any he had heard in years. It was followed by another and then another, until the whole forest seemed to vibrate with the music of the wolves. Jack closed his eyes, letting the sound envelop him. In his mind, he could see Shadow running free with his pack, strong and wild as he always should have been. And although they were separated, Jack knew that the bond between them remained as strong as it had ever been. Smiling, he opened his eyes and looked out at the darkened forest. "Run free, my friend," he whispered into the night. "Run free and be happy." And so, under the starry sky, with the echo of wolf howls in the background, Jack felt a deep peace. His journey with Shadow had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined, and although their paths had separated, the impact of their friendship continued to echo through the forest, touching lives and inspiring hearts. The legacy of Jack and Shadow lived on, not just in the stories told around campfires or in scientific studies, but in the very essence of the forest and its inhabitants. It was a testament to the power of love, compassion, and the connection between all living creatures. As the night wore on and the howls slowly diminished, Jack rose from his chair, feeling lighter than he had in years. He knew that when his time came, he would depart in peace, knowing that his story, the story of a man and a wolf who defied expectations and changed the world around them, would continue to inspire future generations. With one last look at the moonlit forest, Jack went inside, carrying with him the certainty that some bonds are truly eternal, transcending time, distance, and even the barriers between species. End of story.